First of all, welcome. My name is Mike Frank, and I'm the director here of Hoover's Washington, D.C. office. See a lot of familiar faces and some new ones. So for the new faces, if you'd like to be on our mailing list, if you're not already, please sign up. Let us know. We'll be happy to send you invitations to future events here. Today's a very special day. We have one of our senior fellows, John Cogan, here from California. And it's not his first time in Washington, but maybe the first in a while in Washington. So, John, thank you very much for coming out here. John's written a very unique and I think very special book, High Cost of Good Intentions. It's a book that at first blush, may sound awfully geeky and be a tough, turgid kind of a read, but I think when you get into it and finally read it, you'll realize that it's beautifully written, it tells a story, and it will open a lot of eyes. We were up on the House side this morning, meeting with some members of Congress and their staffs, including a lot of members on the House Budget Committee. And I think even for those members who are the most, closest to a lot of these issues, I think their eyes were opened in a lot of different ways. So what we're going to do is a conversational format, and we'll get to some slides in a second. But I just wanted John to have a chance to explain, what made you want to write the book, John? When you were going through it, what did you find maybe that opened your eyes the most, even though you're one of the great experts on this? And also, are there any other, this is, as far as I can tell, and I think you say it in your intro, a book of first impression in a sense. No one's written a comprehensive history of federal entitlement. So let's maybe start off with that, and then we'll take it from there.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you all for coming. As Mike said, I don't get to Washington that often, and there's a reason.
Healthy one.
So when I left Washington, this would have been maybe back in the late 1980s, I drove directly that first day from Washington to Fort Smith, Arkansas. And I got a hotel room, laid down on the hotel bed, and the first thought that involuntarily entered my brain was, thank God I didn't get indicted. And with that recurring thought, it's kept me away from Washington. But it's a real pleasure, pleasure to be back here. But I have to say, I'm not really sure about the timing of this. Here we are, we're about to have the most significant tax reform bill being considered in the House and Senate, introduced this week. And I'm up here talking about the other side of the budget ledger. So, but it could be a lot worse. I have a colleague who was scheduled to, many years ago, scheduled to talk about his book on American politics at the White House. And the very day that he was to appear at the White House was the day that the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke. The poor guy. Talking about bad timing. That was bad timing. But in any event, it's a pleasure to be here. So this book has sort of been a long time in coming. I didn't have an idea of writing it at first. It was really, I'd always, since my time at OMB, had worked on the budget and always been interested in entitlement programs. But then I started a little research on Civil War pensions, just as a sidelight. And I found that all of the patterns that we observe in today's entitlements, congressional behavior that we observe in today's entitlements, I saw them back there in those 19th century Civil War pensions. And then I asked myself, well, gee, if it's there in the Civil War pensions, how far back does it go? So I went back to the Revolutionary War and found the same, very, very same patterns in the Revolutionary War that we see in today. And so it dawned on me, my Lord, the forces that have been at work in driving entitlements forward are not forces that have been operative just in the modern era. These are forces that have been operative as long as entitlements have been around. And so that's what led to the book, which goes back to those Revolutionary War pensions and traces the history of entitlements to try to find the common forces that have been at work in a hope that that once we understand these forces, that we'll be better able to rein in entitlements in the future.
One theme that is recurring, and it's actually one of the, I guess, the principles that anchors the book, is you call it the no less worthy principle. Can you explain that to the audience and how that operates in a mechanical way?
Yes, yes. So this is the way I explain how entitlements grow. So the basic force that's at work is this, of course, desire to help individuals who are unable to help themselves. That's where it starts. But the sort of equally worthy claim or the no less worthy claim idea is as follows. When an entitlement program gets first created, the eligibility is confined to a relatively narrow group of individuals. But after a while, then you see that those individuals that are not eligible, but lie just outside of the eligibility circle, if you will, start clamoring and pressuring for assistance to be included in the entitled group. And Congress eventually acquiesces, usually at a time where there's large budget surpluses in the 19th century or during economic hard times in the 20th century. Congress acquiesces and expands the entitlement to those individuals that they now deem worthy of assistance. But all that does is bring another group of individuals very close to that boundary line, and the process starts over again. And so this repeated process takes a small entitlement program, narrowly prescribed eligibility, and eventually expands it out and makes the original purposes of that entitlement almost unrecognizable in the modern entitlement, or the entitlement after a number of decades. But the idea that drives this, I think, is that we want to treat similarly situated people equally under the law. And the people that are just outside the eligibility group eventually figure out a way to convince Congress that they are no less worthy. They're similarly situated, and therefore they should be treated equally as an included group under the law.
And the book has a lot of examples of how that principle plays itself out. You want to pick one, maybe your favorite might be the pension stories. But
Yes. So my favorite story about how entitlements grow is with the very first entitlement program. It was a disability program for Revolutionary War soldiers. So the initial Revolutionary War disability pension program confined benefits just to members of the Continental Army that were injured in battle. So you had to be injured during your service, wartime service, and you had to be a member of the Federal Continental Army. Okay. 20 years after that program gets put in place, the members of the militia that fought, the members of the volunteers that fought in the Revolution came forward to lay claim that they were no less worthy than the members of the Continental Army were. They bled just as much. They suffered just as much from their injuries. They were no less worthy than those that were receiving the entitlement. And so Congress then expanded the entitlement to those individuals. And this process continued for the next 20 years. By the time you get to the 1830s, virtually every soldier that had served, every person that had served in the Revolutionary War was receiving some sort of pension. The last of these pension acts was the Universal Service Act of 1872. So this is 49 years after the Revolutionary War had ended, right? I mean, life expectancy was around age 60 at the time. The average Revolutionary War soldier was in his mid-70s. So Congress thought there was very few people that would qualify for this program around. So they weren't too worried about its cost. Well, lo and behold, they estimated about 10,000 Revolutionary War vets would apply. A year later, 24,000 had applied, and pensions ended up costing about 25% of the federal budget the next year. In fact, the surprise was so large that everybody was confounded by it. The head of the pension office, the president, Congress. But it led John Quincy Adams to offer this observation. It's my favorite. He says, Uriah Tracy, who was a member of the Senate years before and a good friend of Adams, Uriah Tracy used to say that the soldiers of the Revolution never died, that they were immortal. Had he lived till this time, he would say they multiply with time. So we talked a little bit about the pattern that you see repeatedly in the pension programs. And that Revolutionary War pension program was, of course, the first one. But what you see in it is this incremental expansion of the entitlement from a very narrow group of individuals to a group of individuals who constitute the universe of potential claimants, Revolutionary War soldiers. Each one of these liberalizations is a permanent liberalization. They never go back. So each of these liberalizations set a new base upon which future Congresses would consider the next liberalization. And then finally, Congress back then, just as now, failed to account for the incentives on individuals that entitlements create. And so they tend to underestimate the cost of these entitlements because they underestimate how individuals are going to modify their behavior to qualify for the pensions. So all of those things you see in modern entitlements, you saw back in that very first entitlement program.
And there's other external forces at work that you return to repeatedly in the book. One example would be, which may not surprise people when you describe it, but the role of surpluses. So there are times when federal budget receipts were exceeding predictions, and what did Congress tend to do in those situations relative to various entitlements? Maybe the role that played as well.
Yeah, I think it's probably, you're all not familiar with the concept of a budget surplus. I can't remember the last time I guess I do remember the last time we had it. It was 2001, right?
Yes.
The last time we had a budget surplus. But in any event, this worthy claim idea, the force behind it is magnified in Congress when you have large budget surpluses, right? And so where we first see the effect of these surpluses is in a little fund called the Navy Pension Fund. Now, the Navy Pension Fund was started in 1800, and it was the first major federal government trust fund. It was financed not out of general revenues and not out of some phony accounting procedures, but it was financed by the prize money or booty from captured Navy ships. So when they would capture an enemy vessel or they'd capture a pirate ship, they'd sell off the goods, they'd take a portion of the money, and a portion of the money would go into the Navy Trust Fund. And so the Navy Trust Fund started in 1800, ran very, very well for the first 12, 15 years. And then the Navy Department decided to reach for yield, I guess I would call it. And they started investing, believe it or not, in private securities. So there was a bank called the Bank of Columbia here in DC, and it had a IPO, big stock issue, and the Navy Trust Fund bought a slug of their stock, and then bought the stock of two other private banks. And this Bank of Columbia deal, though, was a real bit of crony capitalism. I think on the board of the president of the company, I think, was John Mason, the son of the founder, George Mason. The former head of the Navy was on the board. Later on, Francis Scott Key went on their board. George Washington was an investor in the company. Harry Lighthorse Lee was an investor in the company. And so this was a clear case of an inside deal, great deal for the bank, but in any event, the stock, all three banks went bust in the 1820s, and the fund then ran out of money. Congress bailed out the fund, but then it started running large surpluses in the 1830s, and the response to those large surpluses was a massive expansion, retroactive expansion of the entitlement benefits offered by the program. So that was the very first trust-funded entitlement. It ran large surpluses, and then as a consequence of Congress expanding eligibility, it then went bankrupt in 1841. So then you get to the Social Security Act in 1935, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the act, but you might not be familiar with the initial financing design. Franklin Roosevelt did not want to impose any future unfunded liability through his system. So he demanded that the fund build up a very large reserve initially that could be drawn upon later to finance future benefits. And so it was all to be a self-financed, self-contained system. And so the initial payroll tax that was set was far higher than the amount of benefits and needed to finance benefits initially. And so the fund built up an extraordinarily large surplus in 1937 and in 1938. And then members of Congress started looking at that surplus and saying, well, gee, couldn't we use this for roads and bridges? And other members, can't we use this for more generous Social Security benefits? And other members saying, no, we got to set it aside for debt reduction, and then we'll be able to issue debt, the corresponding debt down the road to finance benefits. In any event, the outcome of that surplus debate was a very large expansion in the Social Security program. Congress finally said, we're going to get rid of this surplus. Money lying around in the Treasury is not a good idea. And they expanded Social Security at that time to cover survivors, and they expanded the benefits of the program significantly. But the point is that the pressures that built up in 1936, 1937, 1938 led to a very large expansion in the Social Security program initially. That's where the survivors' benefits actually came from. Of course, during the war, we had a large number of workers entering the workforce. Retirements were very low. So once again, Social Security started running a very, very large accounting surplus. Of course, all the excess payroll taxes were being used to finance the war effort. But in the accounting system that Social Security used, they were building up these very large surpluses. So by the time we get to 1950, the fund had a surplus that could have financed more than a decade's worth of benefits. Congress responded under the pressures to do something and raised benefits by an average of 77%. And so if you look at the whole history of Social Security, what you'll find is anytime the program has run a surplus, Congress expanded benefits. In the 1990s, it turns out when they ran surplus as late as that, they didn't expand Social Security benefits, they expanded disability benefits instead. The pressures of surpluses are always there.
And when you have the existence of a surplus, there's another theme that runs through the book, a factor that seems to have to be there. And I imagine somewhere in the lobby of the AARP, there's a tribute to something called the Grand Army of the Republic. Could you talk a little bit about that organization and the role it played in terms of the agitation, the rent-seeking that inevitably seems to arise when these programs are created?
Yeah, so, we think of these large interest groups as being around for a long time and having kind of given birth to the program and then sought to sustain the program. And that's just not so. The main lobbying groups in the United States get formed after the entitlement has been created and after the money has started flowing. The AARP was not around when Social Security was enacted. It was around when Medicare was enacted, but didn't support Medicare prior to its enactment. It was only once the money started flowing that it got its sustenance, if you will, from the program. It became bigger, stronger, and more powerful. But the first great interest group was an interest group that grew up around Civil War pensions, and it has exactly the same history as the AARP does. It was started out right after the war as a way of helping veterans return to civilian life and to caring for those veterans that had suffered wartime disabilities. But once the pension program got going, especially in the 1880s, once the pension program really grew to be quite big, it set up a Washington office. It set up a special committee to deal with helping Congress think about pension legislation and helping the pension office deal with peculiar cases that have come up with respect to individual pension claimants and so forth. And it became the most powerful lobby of the entire 19th century, and really was responsible for what I call the growth of the first great entitlement Civil War pensions. People don't realize just how big the Civil War pension program got to be. But by the 1890s, now this is 30 years after Appomattox, so in the 1890s, the Civil War pension program had nearly 1 million pensioners on the rolls. It was 5 times the number that were on the rolls in the early 1870s, when you would have thought anybody who was going to get a disability pension from wartime service would have already qualified, right? At that time in the 1890s, that program accounted for 40% of the federal budget. So it was one big program, and hence my term, the first great entitlement. But the point about the interest group, the AARP, it was just as powerful. I'm sorry, the GAR, Grand Army of the Public. It was just as powerful as the AARP is.
Is it true, John, that you're the chairman and CEO of the Irene Triplet Society? And you may want to explain who Irene Triplet is.
Irene Triplet's going to send out her descendants to shoot me for that. But I talked a little bit about how Congress, when it legislates on pensions, is operating with a little bit of information. They tend to underestimate the behavioral responses. Well, here's a classic for you. Did you know that there is still one Civil War pension recipient around today? Now, here we are, 152 years, right, from the end of the war, and there's one person still receiving a pension. And that is Irene Triplet. So who is Irene Triplet? Well, she lives, I think, down in North Carolina, I think. But in any event, Irene Triplet is the daughter of Mose Triplet and Elida Triplet. So Mose was served, actually Mose is an interesting character in and of himself. Mose, it's great, Mose served first in the Confederacy, in the Confederate Army. He wasn't eligible for a pension. If you're in the Confederacy, you didn't get a pension, right, for the Union, the United States government. You fought against the government. But then at the end of the war, towards the end of the war, Mose switched sides and became a member of the Union Army. And he was there for more than 9 months. And so he eventually, after the turn of the century, qualified for a pension when Congress did the same thing for Civil War pensions that it had done for the Revolutionary War pensions. It expanded it to virtually everyone who served on the Union side during the war. In any event, Mose married Elida Hall in 1924. Mose was 78. Elida was 28. So it was one of those May to December weddings, you know, that you heard about in a common back there in the east, southeast. In any event, they had Irene, I think 5 or 6 years later. And so Irene Triplet, being the survivor of Mose Triplet, gets a survivor benefit. And it's a modest, you shouldn't worry about it. I told the budget committee this morning, don't worry about it, you know.
It's $73 a month.
$73 a month. So, in any event, that's the story.
And she's still alive.
She's still alive, still around kicking. Right? Yeah. I'm sure I'm going to get a letter from her. What are you doing talking about my pension? Leave my personal life alone.
That's right. Another area that, an external factor that has contributed to the high cost part of your book title would be the role of the courts. And I just want to commend, there's a section in John's book on Supreme Court Social Security cases in the 1930s. And he's an economist, and he's writing about Supreme Court jurisprudence, very clearly written, high commendations for an economist writing so clearly about legal doctrine. Maybe just without getting too much detail, just generally speaking, the role the courts have played, and it goes into the welfare cases in the 60s and 70s as well, in terms of creating expansions and programs that might never have passed Congress had Congress knew at the time this is what they were going to vote on.
Right. Are there any lawyers in the room?
Condolences. Well, there's Adam back there.
Okay, then I'm not going to talk about it.
Peter's not a lawyer.
So actually, the courts played very little role in entitlement programs, of course, until the 1930s. In the 1930s, it was the Social Security case in which the court ruled that Congress could spend money to promote the general welfare. And so it was an entitlement program that gave rise to this interpretation of the Constitution that has allowed the government to spend in so many ways that the 19th century government wasn't spending. And so that was the first role of the court. But once the court stepped into the entitlement arena, it then felt it obliged to adjudicate claims, to decide whether an individual who claimed a benefit and the government had denied that person a benefit, in fact was due that benefit. And in the 1960s, the court became very activist and started issuing rulings in welfare programs like at no other time before or since in its history. And the rulings, in effect, ended up giving welfare recipients an entitlement right, an individual entitlement right to benefits. And the AFDC, now TANF program, was created back in the 1930s. No entitlement right was granted to recipients. And it was the result of a court decision, Goldberg v. Kelly in 1970, that really gave individuals, treated the pension or the benefit they were getting as almost akin to property, was the way that Judge Brennan put it. And so the courts played a very instrumental role in strengthening the rights of welfare recipients to benefits in the AFDC program, the food stamp program, the disability program, and so forth.
And there were cases relating to rolling back reforms at the state level designed to put guardrails around the size of the program, like the man in the house rule, things like that, right?
And it was an amazingly activist period. So the original Social Security Act had the following stipulation with respect to the AFDC program, or welfare program for single moms. And that was that the federal government would provide the funds, but the federal government would not be involved at all in setting the rules and regulations for that program, except for one. They said that no state can have a residency requirement of more than 5 years. And so more than 1 year. Right? And so you could deny a person eligibility for 1 year if they have just moved into the state. But after that, you had to grant them eligibility. So decisions in the 1960s started ruling these state regulations that governed how welfare recipients had to behave, what constituted raising children in a proper home. They started striking those down, and the big case was Hoover versus Smith, where it declared that the HHS had the authority to strike down state regulations regarding what constituted a suitable home for welfare children. And then the most interesting one to me was the residency requirement. A year later, in the late 1960s, the Supreme Court struck down state residency requirements completely. They said that you cannot have a residency requirement in your welfare program. If a person moves from Maine to California, California has to grant them assistance if they qualify under its rules immediately. Well, this was a darned thing because Congress had debated the whole issue in 1935. In the late 1940s, President Truman had tried to get the Congress to go along with eliminating residency requirements. It had a big debate on it. It refused. President Kennedy wanted the residency requirement eliminated, went to Congress, tried to get it. Congress refused again. Then the lawyers went to the courts and got the courts to do it. But the court didn't rule. This is a constitutional ruling. People have a right to travel, is what the court argued. And therefore, you could not deny a person traveling from one state to the next an AFDC benefit. This ruling was, I don't know, Heritage has a top 10, set of bad rulings. This has to rank up there among the great ones. They didn't strike down residency requirements for college tuition. In fact, a year later, they said college tuition differences are okay between residents and non-residents. They didn't strike down residency requirements for elected officials running for office. They just did it in this one area. So it's interesting. The court, very activist period for the court.
And last question on these different themes, and then we can maybe turn to the slides if you want. You do a lot of, pull out a lot of different examples of the role that political considerations played in usually expanding the entitlements. And you make the reference points many times about how many times during an even-numbered year a benefit was expanded that took effect in October of an even-numbered year, and how politicians at some point, I think it may have been initially with FDR, learned the political power of being able to expand these entitlements at the voting booths. Could you maybe go through that a little bit?
Very quickly, yes.
Yeah.
So what I argue in the book is that the Republican Party discovered the political power of entitlements for their reelection in the Civil War pension program. So they regarded themselves, the Republicans, as the party of the Union. That was the party that had saved the Union. The Democrats were the party of disunion, right? And so they were very supportive of pension legislation. And they had an incredible platform. It was high tariffs to protect manufacturing workers, and then high pensions to Civil War Union soldiers that were financed by the revenues from these high tariffs. And so it was an ideal platform they had. And they used this platform, and they used the offices of the government, the pension office, to solidify voter support for the Republican Party. So I say this period of realignment in American politics that starts in the 1890s and goes for the next almost 20 years is where the country realigned itself behind the Republican Party. Republican Party held the presidency and both houses of Congress for 14 straight years during that period. I maintain that it was the distribution of Civil War pension benefits as much as it was the tariff that resulted in that realignment behind the electorate. And of course, now in the modern era, I think it's the Democrats, not exclusively by any means, but they developed the use of, I guess I'll call it a finely honed skill they developed to deliver pensions or Social Security benefits to voters to gain a reelection advantage. In 1950, when they passed this 77% increase in benefits, they scheduled the increase to occur in the October Social Security check, 1 month before the general elections. Same thing in 1952. Republicans caught on in 1954, and they did the same thing, October, for each one of those. But the most amazing story, and I'll finish with this, the most amazing story about this use of Social Security to buy votes is 1972. So 1972 began as kind of a normal year. Social Security was not indexed for benefits back then. So it began as a normal year. House proposes a 5% increase in benefits to compensate recipients for inflation. Senate starts playing around with a 10% increase. But then on the Democratic side, you had Wilbur Mills, Edwin Muskie, George McGovern, and Hubert Humphrey running for the Democratic nominee. So Muskie goes for 15%. And then Mills ups it to 20%. Right? McGovern, 20%. Muskie, okay, 20%. Humphrey, 25%. So that all goes on in the spring of 1972. So then in June, Democrats in the Senate start looking for a vehicle to which they can attach a 20% Social Security benefit increase. Okay? They find it in the debt ceiling bill. So the debt ceiling was to expire on June 30th of 1972. And at that point, actually, the debt ceiling limit was going to go down. So it was a very serious problem. They didn't pass another bill. So it's a must-pass bill. So then a couple of days before the bill is to be voted on, it's going to be voted on June 30th, of course, Frank Church decides he is going to introduce the 20% increase. So he introduces it on June 30th. The United States Senate passes the bill. Very late in the evening on June 30th, they send it over to the House. House has no other choice but to sign the bill, to pass the bill. They pass the bill. Gets sent down to President Nixon just before midnight. He's grumbling about this bill. 20% increase is a huge, huge hit on the budget. But he signs it. He signs the bill in his signing statement. He's very upset with Congress for this behavior. Then, of course, the increase is scheduled to take place in October of 1972, right before the election. And so October comes, Social Security sends out, its Treasury Department actually, sends out the checks to, I don't know, something like 26 million people. And it contains a little note from the Social Security Administration. And the note said, your check contains a 20% increase, courtesy of Richard Milhouse Nixon and the 92nd Congress. So you're gone to taking credit for the entitlement liberalization. So in any event, yes, these, as we all know, these entitlements are a very efficient vehicle for gaining an electoral advantage. With one stroke of the pen, one law, you send out millions of benefits. You're connecting with a particular individual voter. So it's a very efficient way. But it didn't start with the modern Congress, as it goes way back to the Civil War.
I suppose one difference today, let's pull it to the modern time.
Oh, why?
Well, why not? Is that automatic pilot dynamic is in place today. So if Congress does nothing because of all these different things that have been put in place, whether it's court decisions or expansions that became part of an entitlement, the trajectory is going to be ruinous to us, but for some changes that Congress will have to make in the future, which are really hard to make. So they've set us on this path where inaction is the cause of our demise, as opposed to when it first started, when there was a natural limit to how long these things would last and for who they would last.
That's right. The one thing that's different about modern entitlements from the earlier entitlements, of course, for wartime veterans, they would eventually die out. I mean, eventually taken a long time for Civil War pensions, but eventually they would die out as the population of wartime veterans, for particular war, died out. Very different with the modern entitlement, where one group of Social Security, one cohort of Social Security recipients will replace another and replace another. So in a world where you have each expansion in an entitlement becoming a permanent base upon which Congress is going to consider the next expansion, this fact that the population keeps replenishing itself and the entitlement tends to be itself permanent is a very, very important phenomenon in the growth of entitlements. But I have to have a caveat on this automatic issue. Yes, Congress, day in and day out, knows that they have an entitlement problem, knows they have to deal with it, and then they step back and don't deal with it, and the entitlements continue to grow. But I have to say this, you go back to Social Security's history, that incident that I've just spoken about, the 1972 benefit increase, there was another provision in that bill. And the provision in that bill was an automatic cost of living adjustment. And so they put into that bill an automatic provision. But they were saying, stop us before we spend again, was what they were really trying to do. Because it expanded entitlements almost every Social Security almost every 2 years leading up to it. So, so in any event, it's a more complex story than just them legislating these permanent increases.
So an automatic update for cost of living was preferable to a bidding war every 2 years during an election year.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Do you want to go to these? One point about the slides, if we get a chance, is that I mentioned he opened some eyes this morning on Capitol Hill, even among the members on Budget Committee. I think these slides and some of the statistics you have, which maybe you can just recite if you want, or if we can go to the slide, were what was opening up their eyes.
Let me just go to one slide, which I always show. I can see the. Can I?
Just press. I think it's the press.
That one?
Let's see. There you go.
Okay. One more.
There you go.
That's the one. So this slide I show just about every talk that I give. So some of you heard me talk before. You've seen this. But what this shows is federal spending relative to GDP by category from 1947 to 2017. So it's the whole last 7 decades.
2047.
I'm sorry, 47 to 17. So that red line is entitlements as a percentage of GDP. The green line is defense spending as a percentage of GDP. And then the very light line below it is all other programs or non-defense discretionary, mainly programs. So this chart, I mean, it's almost self-explanatory. It's everything you've ever thought about entitlements, right? They account for all of the growth in government spending for over the last 7 decades. Defense spending doesn't count anything, in fact, it's declining. And non-defense discretionary is just about constant. So if you're looking for an explanation for the chronic budget deficits, and we've run budget deficits, 45 out of the last 50 years, you don't have to go any farther than entitlements. They are the sole source of the deficits over the past. You know, when I go out and talk to people around the country, it's different than a group like this, but people around the country, most of them think that it's defense spending that is the principal cause of our budget deficit. And you look at a chart like this and you say, my Lord, the defense spending really has very little to do with the overall fiscal problem that we have. Constituents around the country also say to me, you know, these budget battles that they have where there's a government shutdown, at least they're debating something important. We don't like the government shutdown. But the reality is these budget battles that they're having are all about those 2 lower categories, defense and non-defense discretionary. The budget battles have had nothing to do with entitlement programs. They're all about the discretionary appropriations. The continuing resolution that Congress passed a couple weeks ago that extends to December, that's all about the lower 2 categories. So in effect, Congress has been sort of fighting over the scraps and leaving the big stuff for somebody else to deal with. So that's my message.
And with that, how about we turn to some questions? And we have microphones here. Please, the gentleman right there. Wait, there's a microphone coming.
Hi, I'm Neil Chernoff. When you were talking about this chart, one of the reasons why we tend to focus on defense and we think defense is the big issue is the use of the term mandatory versus discretionary spending. So when they talk about defense spending, they say it's half of discretionary spending.
Right.
But it's not half of total spending. It's, you know, more like down 17, 18%
Yes.
maybe.
Right.
So are we dying by terminology? I mean, are we being deliberately led down a bad path by terminology, and how do we change that?
No, I agree with you. It's not just terminology. It's sort of, you know, when's the last time you've seen in the newspapers around here a serious discussion of the budget side of the ledger? You just don't. I think the press has had a sort of an aversion for some reason of focusing on the budget side, on the entitlements. It's easier to talk about big ticket items like defense, especially if you're in a wartime where the presumption is that the expenditure is going to dominate the budget. But, you know, people have been railing for a long time now about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and their cost to society. Well, their cost to society has been a human cost. It hasn't really been a huge fiscal cost. But I think you're right that we're kind of killing ourselves with the language. You know, funny language. Got to tell you the story. So I did a little interview with the Wall Street Journal on the book a couple of weeks ago, and immediately I got a barrage of emails, and so I got one from a Jay Pickett.
Not Irene Triplett?
I know. I don't think she has email. So I got one from a Jay Pickett. Jay Pickett is really upset with me because I have lumped together Social Security and food stamps under the heading of entitlement, right? And in her mind, food stamps are an entitlement. Social Security is an earned benefit. I think I never thought about entitlement that way. So I decided I was going to write Jay Pickett back. Dear Mr. Pickett, I'm so sorry I offended you. I didn't mean to offend you at all. But here's how I think about entitlements. And I gave Jay Pickett a nice definition of an entitlement, my definition of entitlement. Get a message back from Jay Pickett. Turns out it's Joan Pickett, and I had addressed mine to Mr. Pickett. So now Joan's upset with me for thinking she's a man. And all your talk about Social Security and being an entitlement, she says that's just legal mumbo jumbo. I know what you're really saying. You're trying to denigrate this benefit. Wall Street Journal gets a letter from the editor very next day. Letter from the editor says, once you label something an entitlement is something you can't take away. So once you label something an entitlement, the game is lost. So to that person, the word entitlement meant that the person had an absolute and irrevocable right to that benefit. Of course, to Mrs. Pickett, an entitlement meant no right to that benefit. And so you can't even talk about entitlements in general without getting the world confused. And so we do have a language problem, I think, but I guess I'd say it's more than a language problem.
Governor Barber, welcome, first of all, to be here.
John, it seems that one of the problems is that the newspapers, if you slow down the rate of increase in spending, they describe that as a cut.
Well, that's right.
I mean, and am I right that we could get our entitlement budget in pretty good shape and spending never go down?
Yes.
Just not go up as fast.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And it's interesting the way. Let me give you an extreme example of how that can really work to the detriment of fixing a program. So in most entitlement programs, the benefits are indexed to inflation, right? And the benefits for people coming on the rolls in the next year are higher than the people that are on the rolls this year by inflation, okay? But that's not so with Social Security. Social Security is indexed to wages. So as you go from one cohort of workers to the next, Social Security benefits for the second cohort rise by more than inflation. They rise by the growth in wages. So the real value, inflation-adjusted purchasing power of a benefits paid to somebody who's retired a year from now are going to be higher than for a current retiree, right? And so you got these two different programs. Both of them, you measure cuts from the baseline. In the Social Security program, unless you grant every succeeding generation higher real benefits than they're getting today, that is a cut in the program. In fact, if you passed a legislation that simply said all future Social Security recipients are going to get the same monthly benefits that are paid to current Social Security recipients, adjusted for inflation, that would be an enormous cut as portrayed by the media and by Congress. So I think it's a very, very serious problem. They sort of, in a way, the Washington institutions have built in automatic increases and made it just more difficult for the institutions within Washington to reduce the growth of those benefits. Probably not surprising, but it's a phenomenon.
Okay, Peter, back there, in the back.
If the trends that you describe in your book, and which you illustrate in the chart, persist, how and when does the federal government become insolvent?
That is a 64,000 billion trillion question.
It's in the T's.
Right. So here's the way I answer that question, Peter. Look, what we know from economics is that the taxes that would have to finance the future growth in these entitlements would absolutely cripple an economy. And what we know from history is that the debt that one would have to issue to finance those entitlements are a recipe for an enormous fiscal crisis. So if you don't cut spending, you're either going to, by economics, clobber your economy, lower the standard of living of future generations, or you're going to create an enormous financial crisis, if we believe the historians. The problem for us is we don't know how severe that problem is going to be, and we can't tell when that problem is going to occur. And so that's what makes getting a hold of this problem so difficult. So I'd like to give you an answer that says, I know we're in for a dismal future, and that's going to occur on January 14th, 2028. But you really, we don't have the economists don't have the tools or the information to make such a judgment.
But it is fair to say that if the trends persist, the result will be dismal.
I think so, yes, absolutely. I can't say when, can't say how much. I mean, think about it. Just go back to 2009. Did any economists in the government, how many economists in the government forecast that Great Recession and financial calamity was going to occur? Well, very few. If we look to the future, we'd say we don't have the tools to know. So, but better to take care of a problem, a risky situation, well in advance of it manifesting itself, of the problem manifesting itself.
When Paul Ryan was a senior Republican on the House Budget Committee, and I think he was a minority, so it was maybe 2009, he had CBO take a look at, and Austin's here, right? If Austin's still here, he can help me out here. What would the tax rates have to be if you solve this problem solely on the tax side, and then what other kinds of combinations would have to occur? And the tax rates, I think the lowest one was, if you, in the lower bracket would have to be a 45 instead of 10, and the high bracket I think got into, one was 60s and the other one was 80s. Like the point was, it's inconceivable. But when you do those exercises and you show what that gap translates into in terms of a remedy, you can only really solve it on the spending side. You can't really tax your way into any kind of balance. Another question? Peter, and then we'll go to you.
John, you have established that entitlement spending must be reined in. What will the White House do about this?
Well, we all know what President Trump has said he will do about Social Security and Medicare, which is nothing, right? Having spent the morning up on the Hill, though, I think there's a little bit of optimism on the Hill that the president would be willing to modify his views on Social Security and Medicare. And so they're of the sort of mind that, and this might be just more of the usual behavior, once we get this tax deal done, then we'll talk about entitlements. But I do think that there's some sense on the Hill that the administration is going to soften its views on, at least on Medicare, and probably not on Social Security. In my book, I go through several times where action has been taken to rein in entitlements. And every one of the major changes on the downward side of entitlements has come through presidential leadership. Without the president, you just don't get any significant entitlement reform. And so without the president supporting, leading an effort, we shouldn't expect to get anything. The worrisome thing about that is just looking at the CBO numbers, 5 years from now, if nothing's done, the federal budget deficit will reach $1 trillion. That's a deficit. The increment to the debt will be $1 trillion a year. And so when you think about the lead time that you need to make changes in these large entitlements, and you have a president that's saying, we're not going to touch Social Security and Medicare, you have to be extremely worried about whether we're going to be able to do anything before the consequences fall on us.
And this gentleman right here.
Hi, my name is Kurt Schuler. Following up on Peter Robinson's question, so besides presidential leadership, were there any other characteristics of the episodes in which spending has diminished on entitlement programs?
That's a good question. So, yes, I would say, I won't call it crisis, but I think it's a widespread recognition that a problem exists and that entitlements have to be changed in order to fix the problem. So there has to be agreement on that there's a problem. So let me give you a couple of examples, if I could. It may come as a surprise to you, but the largest reduction of any entitlement program in American history was achieved by Franklin Roosevelt. And we normally think of Roosevelt as being the father of the entitlement state. But the Franklin Roosevelt of 1933 was different than the Franklin Roosevelt of 1934, 35, and so on. When Franklin Roosevelt took office, the Great Depression was upon us. The federal budget was absolutely in shambles. The deficit had reached an absolute historic high for peacetime. Roosevelt had campaigned, he was an economic orthodox at the time, and he had campaigned on a pledge to rein in the budget deficit by curbing federal spending. Well, at the time, veterans programs accounted for 25% of the budget, and the Veterans Compensation Program was a large part of that. So 7 days after he took office, Franklin Roosevelt called on Congress to repeal all veterans' compensation, disability compensation laws, except for the Civil War pension. So World War I disability payments, Boxer Rebellion disability payments, Spanish-American War disability payments, they're all going to be repealed. And he argued that it was the emergency of the Depression, the need to put the government's fiscal house in order. That was why he was doing it. Congress passed that law 7 days later, an act to maintain the credit of the United States government. It's the title of the law. Roosevelt then issued regulations which, within the first year, eliminated nearly 400,000 World War I veterans from the rolls. He wasn't cutting future beneficiaries. He reduced the pension rolls by 50%. Okay? He had a good argument in his mind for it. He had an emergency behind him, and Congress went along with it. Another example, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter actually reduced promised Social Security benefits more than any other president in history. When Jimmy Carter took office, Social Security was 6 years away from insolvency, and Carter proposed to take down future benefits. So at that time, we instituted our modern system of wage indexing of benefits. But the benefits were reduced, not for current retirees, but for those that were age 60 in 1977 and younger. So people that were 5 years away from receiving their Social Security checks ended up having their promised benefits cut by 10%. People that were 7 years away from having their benefits, from collecting their benefits, had their benefits cut by 14%. And so again, it was a crisis that led to Jimmy Carter's successful effort to constrain Social Security. I think Ronald Reagan's efforts in the 1980s, the only president to comprehensively take on entitlements, that was born of an economic emergency. Double-digit inflation, unemployment rising, interest rates at 21%. The country had never seen anything like that before. Excessive federal spending was part of the problem in Reagan's mind. He convinced the public it was part of the problem, and that led to the mandate to take on the entitlements, and Congress passed a slew of entitlement changes. And I'd say the last example would be Bill Clinton and the Republican Congress in the 1990s and welfare reform. Probably the most significant reform of any entitlement in modern American history. And it began with a crisis in welfare, tremendous spurt in the number of people on the rolls, led by unwed teenage mothers. It was a crisis. And so both Republicans and Democrats came up to meet the crisis, and we got the solution. So it's not just presidential leadership. There's got to be some sort of crisis or some sort of problem that everyone recognizes exists, and that a change in an entitlement program can fix, whether it's the economy or a particular program like Social Security or welfare.
And as we were talking about earlier, with the welfare reform episode, there was a sense that not so much the fiscal crisis, but the program was hurting the intended, the good intentions element
That's right.
was not there. It was harming rather than helping the intended population, right?
Yeah, that's very true.
Mm-hmm.
Very true. You know, the argument that won the day in welfare was that the existing system was harming those individuals it was designed to help, and therefore we needed to make a change in the system. So I think there was a sound argument for each one of the policies that I've spoken about, which might be another consideration when you think of what does it take to get an entitlement under control. I don't think just the budget. You can't, but you can't rely just on the budget argument, I guess would be the point. It's got to be a larger argument that you're willing to make that can win the day.
And so the last question, I'll take the prerogative of asking, it was asked this morning by some of the members looking for ideas of how to get out of this conundrum we're in. What type of reforms, in your mind, have the most promise for success? I mean,
Not a lot of history in there to go on.
well, be forward-looking.
And so it strikes me that I hate to say this, but it's incremental. You know, it took a long time for us to get into the fiscal mess that we're in. It's going to take a long time to get us out. Too often, we have tried to make abrupt changes to entitlements, and the reaction has been to defeat any attempt to make changes. We saw that in the 1980s. Remember Haley with the disability insurance program, and all of our efforts were completely undone. So I'm a firm believer in taking incremental steps. But the most important thing is to think long about the changes you're making. Changes that have little effect now, but have a large effect 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road, are the kind of changes that will be sustained and the kind of changes that we need, because the huge fiscal problem is 5, 10, 15 years down the road. So I've sort of been of the mind that whatever you do with entitlements, change the trajectory of them by making a change in the eligibility rules that have a long-term effect, or a change in the benefit rules that have a long-term effect. Don't try to seek big budget savings necessarily right now. That's sort of the lesson, I think.
Okay. Well, with that, please join me in thanking and welcoming John Cogan. Good job.